Hello and welcome back to part 3 of our donut modeling tutorial in Maya. So last we left off, we just added a bunch of sprinkles to the top of the icing using mesh. And in today's video, we're going to take a look at actually creating the materials, the shaders, and doing a little bit of lighting as well. First things first, we need to go ahead and create a light. One of the lights I like to use the most when we're just testing shaders and things is a dome light. So I'm going to come to Arnold over here, and I am just going to create a sky dome light. Okay, so if now I come up to renderer and just go to Arnold, we can now just render this as is in our scene, and we have a little bit of lighting to look at as well. But one of the better ways to do this is if we actually go to our dome light in the attribute editor under color, just press this button here, and then we can add in a HDR image. Essentially, that's just an image, a 360-degree kind of panorama image like this, that's been taken, and it's going to be used as the light source, and we'll provide links in the description on where to get some good free ones. That's what this one is here. A few little settings that will change as well is we'll just reduce the max bounces from 999 down to 10, because 999 is way too high. It's just going to make the render take longer, and we'll leave it around something like that. Now if I go ahead and render this again, you can now see we're getting a little bit more shadow information, and it just looks a lot more interesting than it did before. If you don't want to see this image in the background, by the way, which I often don't, just come back to the attribute editor with your sky dome light selected and put 0 in the camera instead, and then just deselect it there, and then we don't have to look at that anymore. Another thing I like to do as well is just come down to viewport, also put 0 in the sky radius. That way we can't accidentally select it unless we pick it from the attribute editor here. So yeah, that's how we're going to preview our textures. We'll just go ahead and go back to viewport 2.0. And yeah, let's get started. So for the time being, we just want to add a texture to the donut itself. So I'm just going to hide the icing and the mesh that we created. And I'm going to hold down right click on this, go to assign new material, Arnold, and then open PBR surface. Okay. So now that's just going to look white because that's the default color of this texture, and then let's just rename it something like Donut Shader. Okay, so to begin with, we're going to want to add a sort of donut-y looking color. So we're going to go to yellow to begin with, and then go a bit more into the orange. Maybe bring some of the intensity down a little bit on that and make it a bit darker. Maybe a bit more orange. Maybe something kind of like this. Just play around with this to get a kind of like color closer to whatever reference you're following. I'm going to go with something kind of like this, like a golden-y, crispy sort of color. And that's okay, but we're missing that line, like that lighter line down the middle, which you get, I think, from the way donuts are cooked, right? Like they're normally just placed in oil, and the tops and bottoms sort of cook quicker than everything else, so you get this sort of like slightly less cooked line in the middle. So how do we add that? Well, if you come to this little blue ball here, this is the Hypershade Editor, open it up, you're going to be presented with a window like this, okay? By default, it's probably going to be blank, and we want to be able to see our texture. So if we come up to this material window up here, you can see we have our donut shader. Just click that, and it'll be highlighted yellow, and then press this button just to graph that for us. So to do this, we're actually going to create something called a ramp. So if you just type in ramp, you want to take in the AI ramp RGB, okay? By default, this is going to be black and white, but go ahead and just plug that into the base color. Now, by default, you're not going to see anything, but if we just go ahead and render this so that we can see what's happening. If I adjust this line here, you can now see that it's going up towards the top. Okay, you can see the black is taking more of an effect. If I was to bring the white all the way down, you can see it gets a lot brighter. So if you just press this little arrow here, that's going to bring up the window. So what we actually want to do is swap over this black color to the color we just created for our donut. If I click in this box here, we'll have the color history from the ones that we just made, so I'm going to pick that. And I'm going to do the same for this one here as well. We'll just make that the same color. So now our donut is the same color that we created before. Maybe a little bit brighter, actually. So I might just darken that down slightly. Take it back to where we were. Something like that, okay? Now, how do we add the line in the middle? So if I just click in the middle of this grid, you can see it adds another point. And if I change the color of this to something a bit brighter, maybe something like this, you can now see the whole donut starts to brighten up. But if we drag these points like this, closer to the middle, okay, you can see we're going to start to get a bit of a line forming in the middle of the donut. Okay, it's a bit faint at the moment, but you can see now we have this line forming. That's because if you think about it, it's basically the ramp is represented on the model here. So we have the darker brown bits up here and then the lighter whiter bit in the middle. So if I was to make that completely white, you can see that's way more obvious. So we're going to play around with the colors just a little bit to make this a little better looking. Maybe I'll make this have a bit more color to it. Something like this. Okay, and then maybe we'll change the smoothing. You can change the interpolation, which is basically just kind of how, you know, how much it smooths the difference between the 2 points. So if I change that to none, then you can see we've got this quite harsh line, but we don't really want that. So we can maybe pull back a little bit here. So that's how you can kind of very quickly add a line in the middle, and you can adjust this, you know, maybe you want the line to be a bit less obvious, a bit more smooth, just pull those points away. Or if you want it to be a bit sharper, just pull them closer, kind of like that. Okay, and then you can just change the color of that as well if you want that to be much, much brighter. Okay, I think I'm going to make mine a bit brighter. Something like that. So that's how you do that, and we could take this a step further, and we can actually model this in slightly as well. If I kind of pull this back a bit so that this line kind of lines up around with the center of the donut. Like so, okay? And then if I just do an edge select, just select this, and then if I just scale this in a little bit, you can see that makes that crease a lot more defined, and you do kind of get that on donuts, right? They have this kind of dip in here. So already this is looking a lot more like a donut than we had, and literally all we're using is just a ramp with a few different colors and a slight tweak to the geometry. So I'm actually happy at this point to go ahead and close that. And you can play around with that a little bit more if you want to experiment more with the colors here. So for the time being, we're going to open back up our Hypershade Editor. And what if we want to add a bit of color variation to our donut, right? To the parts which aren't in the middle of this white line here. So to do that, we can actually go ahead and plug another texture map or image file or noise or something like that into these colors on the ramp. So a lot of this kind of node-based thing, once you get used to it, is quite intuitive. Things just sort of plug into each other, and you do have to play around with it a long time to see what works and what doesn't. But to add some color variation here, what we can do is if you press tab again and just type in noise, we'll just take a default noise texture like this. Okay, and if you just click on that, you can see it has this sort of pattern that we're going to use to drive some sort of like color difference, right? Because when we were looking at the reference of our donut, it was sort of brown, but it had these reddish spots in it as well. So we're going to use this to actually replicate that. By default, it's black and white, but if you open it up, come to the right-hand side under color gain, just change that to the color you were using for your donut. Okay, and the color offset is going to be the black points, okay, or the darker points. So we can mess around with this to create a new sort of color or texture map for our donut. So to plug that in, what we're going to do is select the ramp, okay? Make sure that you have one of the points selected which corresponds to your donut color, not the center ring line. Okay, middle mouse click and drag the noise over to the selected color. Okay, and then we'll do the same for the other side as well. So now essentially what this is doing is it's using this noise texture to apply to the color on our ramp. So if with the noise texture selected, if I come back to our render, you can now see we're getting what looks like kind of a dirty moldy donut. So what this will mean is we just need to tweak the colors a little bit again. So we can just spend a bit of time doing that. just to add a bit more kind of difference here. Okay, and then we can also adjust the frequency of the noise to make that a bit more extreme or less extreme. I think I'm going to make it a little bit less extreme. Maybe something like this. And we can also adjust the threshold, which is sort of how extreme that noise texture is going to be. The amplitude as well, which also adjusts how extreme it is. The depth max, which is sort of like how detailed each like part of the noise is. I might bump that up to like 4. Okay. And maybe just play with the color a little bit more. You can also change the type of noise here. By default it's set to billow, but I generally like to use a purlin noise. I think it just looks a little bit more even. And more interesting. And that's looking okay, maybe a bit too much, so I might reduce the amplitude just a little bit. Maybe something like that. So we're just adding a little bit of color variation, right? Nothing crazy. Just something to kind of break up the color slightly. So it's not all just one tone. Okay, so that's the colors, but what if we want to actually add some bumpiness to this? And right now it's also looking very shiny as well, a bit like a plastic donut, right? So how can we change that? So if you come back to our Hypershade Editor, okay, we have the specular roughness. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new noise texture. Okay. And we're going to plug that into the specular roughness. Now, this kind of defines how reflective or rough an object is. And for this, we actually can't just plug the color straight in. If you were to try that, you would see it just goes gray and we can't plug it in. It only lets you plug it into a few different things. What we actually want to do is just expand this color here with the plus, and you see we've got color, out color R, G, and B, red, green, and blue. We're going to want to take the out color red and just plug that into the specular roughness on its own. Okay. And then just select the noise texture so that we can edit that. So if we now come back to our render view, you can see we're getting a bit more of an interesting pattern in the reflection, right? It now looks like some parts are really, really rough, whereas some parts are a little bit more reflective. If I go ahead and change it over to a purlin noise, you can see we now have a much more interesting reflection. And if you look at things like donuts, you know, they might have leftover oil or kind of grease on them, or just any like minor differences in the surface could make the shininess kind of varied, right, on the donut. So go ahead and play around with this a little bit. You can increase the frequency if you wanted to, and then adjust things like the color gain. If you to reduce this, it looks like it's coated in some sort of syrup, which is pretty cool, and if that's what you want to go for, you can certainly do that. I'm probably going to keep it around about here. The color offset as well, which is kind of like is going to make everything look a bit more rough, and the threshold as well. So play around a little bit with these settings, see what each one does. I want my donut to have a little bit of shine to it. Nothing too crazy. Something like this. Maybe I'll increase the color offset a little bit and then reduce the color gain, just to make that a little less contrasty. Put a bit more shine into it. Okay, maybe something like that. So there's a bit of a drier looking donut if we go with something like that, which is okay. So it's just kind of about experimenting with these settings, playing around with them, getting what you like. But it just, you know, if we look at it from this angle, you can see the light's just reflecting a bit nicer off of the donut. Okay, and that goes a long way to making it look a bit more realistic, a bit more like an actual donut. But now the surface is looking incredibly smooth, right? And if you look at the surface of a donut, it's not really that smooth. I mean, they you know, you'll get, depending on how they're made, they could look a little bit different. But this is looking more like a kind of like super duper smooth cartoony bagel. We want to add a bit more of a like cakey, spongy texture to this. So what we can do is if we come back to our Hypershade Editor, okay, just move some of these out of the way, and then press tab again and just type in bump. We're going to take an AI bump 2D node, okay, and put the out value into the normal camera down here. And then we're going to create another noise texture. So we're doing a lot of this procedurally. Instead of using texture maps, we're just creating noise and using the default UVs, and then using that to create a procedural texture that doesn't actually require us to do any UVs or anything like that. So it's a bit simpler, and it works quite well for food items like a donut. So we're going to go ahead and take the out color red again, and just plug that into the bump map. Okay. So by default, the bump height is set really low, 0.010, okay? And with that, you actually can't really see any sort of difference. So if you just start gradually increasing this, if I was to whack this all the way up to 1, we now have what looks like a very, very rocky looking donut, okay? So you want to find a sort of middle ground for this, and by default, the noise isn't really doing much for us. It doesn't really work. But you can see now we have a bit of texture on the donut itself. So if we come back to our noise texture, just select that so that we can preview it on the right, and then come back so that we can adjust this and see it on the fly. We're going to change the noise type again to a Perlin noise. Okay, and then maybe we'll increase the frequency up to something a fair bit higher, like 33 or something like that. Okay, and then from here we can just start tweaking the settings. Okay, and again, these things do various different things depending on what you do. I might reduce the def max down to something like 2. Maybe reduce the amplitude a little bit. I'm just looking to add a bit of bumpiness, nothing crazy. Okay, now if you see, if we look from this view with the light reflecting off of it, we have a much more interesting looking surface. It doesn't look quite as plain as it did. Maybe we'll reduce that down to 0.05. Some of these values don't really have to be particularly high. It's just about being sort of subtle. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with that. What if now we want to do the same thing for our icing? So we'll go ahead and enable the icing. And that's just looking nice and grey now. But we'll do what we did before. We'll select it, go ahead, right click, assign new material, Arnold, and then open PBR surface. Okay. And then for this, let's just have it a nice solid color. I think I might go with a sort of chocolate icing type color. So we're looking to create a brownish, reddish color. Something like this, okay? But you could make it pink as well if you want to. That might be a bit too electric pink. I wouldn't need that. That looks kind of radioactive. But something like this, if that's what you want to do, go ahead. You don't have to follow this exactly. But I'm going to go for a chocolatey sort of coating like this. Okay, and then we can do the exact same thing we did with the donut. We can also plug in some noise textures into the roughness for this. So if we come back to our Hypershade Editor, you'll now see that we have this new texture here. It might be on top of things, so we'll just move that out of the way. Down to here. And I could go ahead and actually duplicate this noise texture. If I just select this one here that says noise 2 and just come up to edit and then duplicate and then shading network, that will then duplicate that for us. And then we can take the color red and plug that into the specular roughness as well. Come back to our scene, you can see we now have that there too, but that's looking a bit too dry. I think I want the icing to look a bit more shiny. So maybe we'll adjust this a little bit. Reduce the color gain. We just want this one to be a little bit more subtle. Just a bit of variation. Okay, And then I might not plug any bump into this. Just keep it nice and sort of smooth. We can see now already we're getting something that looks a little bit more accurate. We've got that nice ring around here. We've got some color breakup in the donut. We've got some specular roughness on both the donut and the icing. So the last thing to do would be to add some textures to our sprinkles. So if we go ahead and re-enable the sprinkles, they just have a default gray material. But what if we want these to have all sorts of different colors? So to do that, we can create 3 different shaders. So we have our original sprinkles down here. If I were to add a new material to, say, this first sprinkle here, okay? Assign new material, Arnold, and then open PBR surface. And if I just change the color of this to, like, pink, you can see all the sprinkles in the mesh network, which are using this first sprinkle, have now also adjusted to the same color. And this is why we kept the mesh network, because it's going to allow us to adjust the sprinkle color on the fly. So if we go ahead and just rename this Sprinkle Shader 1. Okay, maybe we'll keep these as pink. I quite like that. Reduce the intensity of that a little bit. Maybe for the next ones we'll have blue sprinkles, so we'll select the next one in the list. Apply a new shader. Okay, and then this will be Sprinkle Shader 2. And then from here we'll pick a blue. Reduce that a little bit so it's not so radioactive looking. And then for Sprinkle Shader 3, we'll do the exact same thing. Arnold, open PBR surface, rename that again. It's a good idea to rename your shaders as you're making them as well, because you can see we've already got a fair few, right, for each different part, and it can get a bit confusing if you're not sure what which one's which. Maybe for these, we'll... something kind of reddish color like this. Okay, that's a little bit hideous looking, but you get the idea. So now we've gone ahead and very, very quickly added different colors to all of our sprinkles. Actually, you know what? I don't quite like that being red. Let's make these a bit more white color. Like that. Okay. You could even, if you want to, go ahead and plug a normal map into each of these sprinkles, right? Like if I pull up the Hypershade Editor, maybe pull up the Sprinkle 1 shader. We go ahead and create a new AI Bump 2D. Get another noise. Plug that into our bump map. And then just increase the bump height. You can see now we're getting a bit of bumpiness on the sprinkles, basically for free, and it's not really going to impact much of the render time at all. When you zoom out, it's not going to be quite as obvious, but you can really go quite far with the detail with this. Very, very granular, and improve things as much, really, as you want, or as little as you want, whether or not you want it to be stylized or quite realistic looking. So yeah, that's how you add shaders to your donut. I hope you have enjoyed this episode. The next part will be coming out tomorrow, part 4, where we'll look at actually rendering and doing the final lighting and saving out a finished rendered image for our donut. So yeah, thank you very much for watching. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you again tomorrow. Bye-bye.